Folks, it seems like the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are starting to really focus in on some of their offensive coordinator candidates. This has been reported by Mike Garafolo of the NFL Network that Bengals quarterbacks coach Dan Pitcher will have his second interview with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers coming up this week. The first interview that was conducted by the Buccaneers and Dan Pitcher was before the AFC Championship game, where the Bengals lost to the Kansas City Chiefs, and now they have a second interview coming into place. Joining me is the ever so wonderful Evan Wanish of the Cannon Fire podcast and BucsNation.com, as well as the host of the Real to Real podcast. Evan, what are your thoughts on Dan Pitcher getting this second interview here with the Buccaneers?
Well, it obviously shows significant interest in Dan Pitcher. And I think actions by the Bengals a few weeks earlier actually show that there might be significant interest in Dan Pitcher from maybe another team, and maybe it's the Buccaneers, because the Bengals actually gave him a contract extension and a raise to stay as their quarterbacks coach. Now, obviously, you know, didn't really work too well because Pitcher's still taking this interview as the offensive coordinator. If the Buccaneers wish to, and since he's taken it, if they wish to offer him that, I would imagine he would take it. So, it's clear that the Bengals really value him, and they really feel maybe in danger of losing him. So I think that's clear that the Buccaneers have significant interest in a guy like him. Now, obviously, the first one was virtual. This one's in person. It was also interesting to note that Todd Monken's interview with the Buccaneers was virtual. That wasn't by design. It was supposed to be in person, but due to some issues, like travel issues, they had to do it virtually. So do wonder if maybe Monken would get a second interview this time in person. But yeah, pitchers got an in person interview, which to me clearly shows that they have an interest in him, and I think he's pretty high up on their board. And it'd be a pretty significant hire. I've seen a lot of different Bengals reporters, and obviously we don't follow the Bengals as closely as they do. I've seen a lot of different Bengals reporters really think that the Bengals could be hurt by losing a guy like this, pitcher here.
Yeah, and I think that whenever you look at Pitcher and what he has done with, a guy like Joe Burrow for the past couple of years there in Cincinnati, it's really been some great work. But, I mean, you have talked about the idea of, hey, a guy who hasn't called plays yet at an NFL level or really at all as a coach, is that a guy that you want to bring in for such a crucial season where Todd Bowles, Jason Light really have to nail this offensive coordinator hire? Do you want to take a risk with a guy who, yeah, has a pretty darn good resume as a quarterback developer, but doesn't have any experience as a play caller? That is the conundrum that the Buccaneers are faced with. And I do believe Scott Reynolds, our colleague over at PewterReport.com, talked about this, that he expects there to be some type of a decision in the next couple of weeks for the Buccaneers regarding a offensive coordinator hiring. Of course, there will definitely be, I would say, a couple more second interviews that are going to be happening here in the next week or so. But pretty interesting that Dan Pitcher here is the first one to get that shot. Evan, if you had to make a guess, I know you talked about Todd Monken, maybe he gets the second interview. Would there be anybody else that would come to mind for you as to who could get second interviews? And then also give me your thoughts on Dan Pitcher, his work as a quarterbacks coach, but also his lack of offensive play calling experience at the NFL level.
Well, I mean, just to touch on the lack of experience there, it's a risk. Um, Sort of a risk versus reward thing, because I think it's sort of boom or bust there. You've seen a lot of, these first year head coaches that are offensive play callers. Oh, they're, masterful. But there's also some that really flame out. Byron Leftwich didn't really have much experience calling plays before the Buccaneers in 2019. Had some success, but then once he was sort of left on his own, to have his offense, it didn't really work. In Pitcher's case, I imagine it would be pretty much his offense. So that's a risk there for sure. As far as guys for second interviews, I do think Monken could get one. I know they have pretty high interest in him. I think a guy like Clint Kubiak might get one. I think they came away pretty impressed with him. And I wouldn't it wouldn't shock me if he was a guy that got another one. So I don't expect all of them, all the seven candidates that they interviewed. I don't expect them all to get second interviews. I think you're going to start seeing that list narrowed down a little bit, but wouldn't shock me if those two names got another interview. And then you talk about sort of the 2 weeks thing. I think you're coming to a decision sooner rather than later because now one like they want to have an offensive staff sooner, like I said, sooner rather than later, and now you know who the quarterback isn't going to be. You don't exactly know who the quarterback is going to be, but you know the quarterback isn't going to be Tom Brady, which the last time we talked about these offensive coordinator interviews, you didn't know if Tom Brady was going to return or not. So there was a little bit of a mystery there. Now that mystery's solved. Like it's not going to be Tom Brady. So I think it makes the decision for both the Bucs and the candidate. Like the candidate also, if the candidate doesn't want the job, he can reject the job. So I think that makes the decision a little bit easier as well on both sides. So to know exactly what you're walking into now, and I do think, a decision for the Bucs later. You want to get that offensive staff in place, get their opinions on free agents, get their opinions on draft, who to resign, who to target in free agency once that opens, who they like in the draft, who they've been eyeing, especially with the offensive. With you having such an important position, seemingly open, you want to get that offensive coordinator's opinion. And while I'm sure they talked about that in the interviews, you still haven't gone probably as in depth about how would he fit in your system and this and that. So I do think they want to get this thing wrapped up, but also, like you said, they have to nail this one.
Yeah,
Sure, they're getting the right guy.
yeah, I think that whenever you look at that, right? Like I've seen a lot of people be critical of the Bucs and say, what offense coordinator would want to come here? They don't have a quarterback. They don't have a great, people have been really down, right, since the retirement of Brady. And I don't think that's accurate. Me and you have both talked about this. This team still has a lot of talent. And while some people may say the Bucs not having a quarterback would deter guys from wanting to take an offensive coordinator job, I feel like you can also look at it as that might be an interesting thing for an offensive coordinator. They get to pick who they want at quarterback, who they want to work with, be it in free agency or in the draft or via trade or anything along those lines. I think that all those things
Or
are
or if they want to work with Kyle Trask, they get to pick that.
right. And I think that all those options are on the table and they're going to want the input of an OC. And I think that that is an appealing thing. If Dan Pitcher wants to work with a Baker Mayfield or a Jacoby Brissett or somebody along those lines, he's totally going to have the option to do that. And I think that can be appealing. Now, Evan, let me ask you this. With the idea of Dan Pitcher being that first guy to get two interviews here, do you think that that makes him, one of the more front runner guys for this, or maybe is it just coincidental? What is kind of your take on Dan Pitcher being the first guy to get two interviews here?
I do think it's telling because obviously they weren't able to conduct a in-person interview with him at the time that they were doing their first round because the Bengals were still in the playoffs, so they weren't able to conduct an in-person. So it's interesting to me that right when they get back from the Senior Bowl, right when Todd Bowles and Jason Light, everything dies down, all the scouts come back, they're back in Tampa and everything. That this is the first guy, so I do think that's a sign that they have significant interest. And I would say pitcher's probably a top two candidate. Now, that's if he wants it. He just got a raise and an extension. So maybe he wants to stay in Cincinnati with a very, very talented and young quarterback in Joe Burrow. So just went to the Super Bowl last year, went to the AFC Championship game this year. Does he want to leave that? So we'll have to wait and see. But I do think that I would say he's probably pretty high up there in terms of candidates that the Bucs like.
And that's the last thing I want to mention here is when I saw that Dan Pitcher had gotten that extension from the Bengals, my thought was, that's it. Looks like Dan Pitcher's not going to be the OC of the Bucs, right? But now he's getting this second interview. How much of a deterrent do you think that extension is for the possibility of Pitcher taking this job with the Bucs potentially versus staying with the Bengals, or do you feel that because he had a second interview, it's kind of a moot point right now?
Yeah, I would have told you the same thing when he had the extension. I figured they put that in place to make sure he stayed. The Buccaneers gave Todd Bowles an extension as their defensive coordinator after the Super Bowl to make sure he stayed. Um, but yeah, to me, this second interview sort of makes that a moot point because clearly Pitcher could have declined the interview. He did not have to interview. So I think there's clear interest with Pitcher in being an offensive play caller and an offensive coordinator. So I don't really think that's going to stop this at all. I think if the Bucs want him and he wants the Bucs, I don't think it's going to stop much at all.
So finally, Evan, hey, here for Dan Pitcher, his second interview. For me, he's one of my more favorite candidates out there. I would say he's probably my favorite candidate who doesn't have any experience previously as an offensive coordinator. And even with guys who do have previous experience, I would say he's still probably like a top three guy in my opinion. What are your thoughts and opinions on maybe even top two? What are your thoughts and opinions on Dan Pitcher in your own personal opinion, ranking him in terms of all the available candidates right now out of the seven guys?
Well, I think when you're looking at it, the big thing for me is social media's reaction. And yes, social media, the people on social media don't know half of what an NFL front office knows. But the reaction that a lot of Bengals, reporters and a lot of Bengals media and just personnel, people that follow the Bengals really don't think it'd be a great idea to lose this guy. And to me, that's a positive sign. To me, you look at his resume and working with Joe Burrow's entire career, what Joe Burrow has turned into, that's pretty good, And obviously, it's not just Dan Pitcher. It's Joe Burrow's talent. It's the weapons around him. It's the offensive coordinator. It's the head coach. But like Dan Pitcher certainly had a hand in it. So I think that really helped. So I do agree. I think he's in my top two overall probably. I think it's the Buccaneers top two as well. I think it's him or Monken. I think now, they might be transitioning to pitcher because maybe they've received word that Monken might want to just stay at Georgia, which is certainly possible. That's a cushy job. He's making a ton of money, could be going for three straight national titles. So, I think pitcher would be a pretty big hire. And I think that's why they're doing their due diligence on him right now.
But folks, let us know your thoughts and opinions about Dan Pitcher getting this second interview. Do you want to see him as the Buccaneers offensive coordinator? Are you impressed with his work with Joe Burrow? Or are you a little bit worried about his lack of play calling experience? Would love to hear your guys' thoughts and opinions. Go check out Evan's work over at BucsNation.com. He just actually put out a very awesome, heartfelt piece about Tom Brady retiring. I highly recommend you check that out. Also, you can go watch him over at the Cannon Fire podcast, also at the Real to Real podcast as well, where we are both on there. Evan, thank you so much for being a part of this episode. Greatly appreciate it. Folks, thank you all so much for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed. And as always, folks, we will see you in the next video or the next live stream. But until then, and as always, guys, goodbye for now, and go Bucs.